Have you ever wondered why some ideas challenge us so deeply that they discomfort us to the core? What's worse, confronting uncomfortable truths or continuing to live in illusion? What if someone told you that everything you believe could be just a comforting lie? Imagine someone who looks at the world and says, all of this is fragile, illusory, historical, and it's crumbling. That someone was Friedrich Nietzsche. But why does it disturb us so much? Could it be because it forces us to step out of our comfort zone? Or is it that we hate Nietzsche because, deep down, he makes us feel vulnerable, with no solid ground beneath our feet? Do you think Nietzsche was wrong, or did he know something that no one else dared to admit? One curious thing about great thinkers is that often they fear being fully understood more than being misunderstood. Friedrich Nietzsche is a perfect example of this. Among all the philosophers who have passed through history, he may be one of the most provocative, a true divider of opinions. His ideas have left a mark in fields ranging from art to ethics, even influencing existentialism. But there are also those who simply detest what he represents. Whenever I talk about Nietzsche, it only takes a video for the comments to fill with heated opinions. Many people love him, many people hate him, and sometimes those reactions say more about the commenters than about the philosopher himself. Thinking about this, I decided today to address some of the most common criticisms surrounding him. Let's explore why he has become a true catalyst for debates, and along the way, try to understand whether these criticisms are fair, or if they stem from misunderstandings and caricatures. A disclaimer right now. What you'll hear here is my interpretation of Nietzsche. I don't pretend to offer the final word on what he truly meant, because if there's one thing Nietzsche didn't want, it was to be reduced to simple conclusions. My plan is to divide these criticisms into stages. First, I'll present the ideas of Nietzsche that sparked controversy. Then, we'll dive into the criticisms themselves. And finally, we'll discuss whether these are based on facts or distortions of his original ideas. So, without further ado, let's start with the central point of many controversies: Nietzsche's peculiar view on morality. If there's something you've probably heard about Nietzsche, it's how he challenged traditional morality. One of his most well-known ideas, and not by accident one of the most controversial, is his analysis of what he called the morality of resentment. In works like Beyond Good and Evil and On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche makes it clear that he's not interested in knowing which ethical system is correct or true. For him, absolute truth in ethical matters simply doesn't exist. Instead, Nietzsche wanted to understand why we adopt certain values. What led our moral beliefs to develop the way they are today? Nietzsche wasn't afraid to touch on sensitive topics. He believed that Christian morality, and by extension many of the egalitarian ideas derived from it, were sustained by a powerful psychological mechanism: resentment. And here's where the discomfort begins. But does this make him a tyrant, as many accuse, or was he simply misunderstood and turned into something he never intended to be? This is just the beginning of our journey through this fascinating figure. Let's untangle the knots that connect Nietzsche to the controversy and discover together what's behind all the uproar surrounding his name. Friedrich Nietzsche, by training, was a philologist, that is, a scholar of classical languages and cultures. When immersing himself in ancient texts, he noticed something fascinating. These cultures exalted values like physical strength, power, and skill, qualities that, in the modern morality influenced by Christianity, had lost prestige. This observation was the starting point for many of the provocative ideas Nietzsche developed throughout his work in ancient societies. Heroes and prominent figures weren't ashamed of their ambition or pride. On the contrary, those characteristics were celebrated. For these thinkers, humility and piety were not central virtues. Someone like Achilles, for example, would never say, "I am a sinner in constant search of redemption." Instead, he would affirm something like, "I choose glory because I have the power and skill to conquer it." Nietzsche believed that the arrival of Christianity profoundly altered Europe's moral landscape. For him, this new morality didn't come from a place of strength, but from weakness and resentment. A central theme in his work on the genealogy of morals. According to Nietzsche, in a time he called pre-moral, the strongest naturally assumed leadership roles. It wasn't about a sophisticated idea of self-control or power over oneself, but about direct and objective strength capable of shaping the world around them. However, Nietzsche acknowledged that even these strong individuals needed to overcome internal challenges to exercise their power. For him, true strength wasn't just the ability to dominate others, but also to overcome oneself. On the other hand, those with less power, the weaker individuals, often felt frustrated, both by their inability to impose their wills and by being at the mercy of the stronger. This resentment, according to Nietzsche, gave rise to a new morality. The slave morality. In this system, values like goodness, weakness, non-violence, and piety began to be exalted. But Nietzsche saw this as a calculated strategy, a form of philosophical revenge by the weak against the strong. This new moral system, for Nietzsche, had two main purposes. First, it reduced the power exerted by the strongest, creating a context where the powerful were encouraged to show compassion for the weak, thus reducing the risks of abuse. Second, it limited the growth potential of the stronger individuals. Someone raised to believe that the pursuit of power is inherently bad, and that being harmless is a virtue, will hardly develop their true strength. For Nietzsche, this inversion of values represented one of the most significant events in human history. He didn't just question the foundations of Christian morality, but also challenged each of us to reflect on the origins and intentions behind the values we consider unquestionable. The invitation he makes is clear: understand and perhaps overcome the limitations imposed by this slave morality, seeking a life that celebrates creative power and self-overcoming. In his bold critique of morality, Nietzsche described an intriguing phenomenon he called the revaluation of values. He believed that modern society's ethical norms, especially those influenced by Christianity, were born from a feeling of resentment. The only method for obtaining satisfaction against their enemies and tyrants was through a radical revaluation of values, which also represented an act of the most ingenious revenge. Nietzsche wrote, "Christian morality, with its principles of equality, compassion, and altruism, did not represent a glorious advancement of civilization, but a clever strategy of the weak to subjugate the strong." This slave morality, as he called it, transformed virtues like power, ambition, and self-sufficiency into sins, while elevating sacrifice, submission, and forgiveness as supreme virtues. For Nietzsche, this inversion of values did not signify progress, but rather a decline in human greatness. From this perspective, humanity, by focusing on the weakest, had forgotten its creative and transformative potential. Instead of aspiring to greatness, we became trapped in the limitations of a morality that seeks to level everyone on the same plane. Nietzsche believed it was time to surpass this paradigm by creating new values that celebrated strength, creativity, and self-overcoming values that could be shaped by those he called Bermensch, or superhumans. But what exactly did Nietzsche propose? Was he talking about a return to ancient morality, that of the nobles, or about creating something entirely new? This question remains open as his work leaves room for diverse interpretations. While some passages suggest he saw these new values as something personal, to be lived individually, others seem to indicate that these values could eventually reshape society as a whole. Of course, not everyone agreed with Nietzsche. Lev Tolstoy, for example, saw his proposal as a threat to the ethical foundations that uphold human coexistence. For Tolstoy, the idea of loving thy neighbor as thyself wasn't just a virtue, but the indispensable basis for any just society. He feared that abandoning these principles would leave us adrift, without any reliable moral structure. Dostoevsky also raised questions about what would remain of humanity if these values were abandoned. Christian morality, even with its flaws and corruptions, still represented, for him, an ethical compass that offered hope and cohesion. Additionally, there is discomfort with the figures that Nietzsche admired. For example, he exalted Napoleon as a man capable of shaping the destiny of Europe. But he also praised the way Napoleon treated others as inferior to him. Today, these ideas clash with modern sensibilities that value equality and dignity for all. Reflecting on Nietzsche, it is impossible not to question our own values. Are we trapped in a morality that limits our potential, or is this morality, with all its imperfections, the only viable path toward a more just society? Perhaps true wisdom lies in finding a balance, recognizing the need for compassion and equality, without abandoning our drive to overcome ourselves and create something extraordinary. Nietzsche is often criticized for his supposed lack of emphasis on caring for others, which some consider a weakness in his philosophy, especially from a psychological perspective. Psychologists like Martin Seligman, for instance, argue that genuine care for others is essential for a truly fulfilling life. It's not that Nietzsche completely rejects this idea. In Beyond Good and Evil, he devotes a significant part of his reflection to the relationships between noblemen, exploring how exceptional individuals can occasionally show generosity toward the weaker ones. However, his criticism of what he called slave morality, which places universal care at the center of virtue, and his emphatic statements about contempt for the weak, end up giving his philosophy a tone that many consider excessively selfish. For most, it's difficult to accept this idea without some resistance. Still, this is a point that deserves attention, and we will undoubtedly revisit it later. But the question that remains is, does this objection to Nietzsche partly arise from a misunderstanding of what he really proposes? An essential point here is that Nietzsche never expected his ideas to be accepted by all. He saw his philosophy as something destined for a few, those capable of breaking with centuries of conditioning based on traditional morality. But for him, humanity is so immersed in this slave morality that we instinctively react against any attempt to question it. Still, it's possible to interpret Nietzsche in a less rigid way, finding in his works a genuine love for humanity. Thus spoke Zarathustra, for example. The titular prophet expresses a deep desire to see humanity reach its highest potential. From this perspective, Nietzsche's apparent harshness toward weakness can be understood not as tyranny, but as the stance of a demanding father figure who challenges his children not to settle, not to waste their lives. That said, it's also easy to fall into the opposite extreme, softening Nietzsche's ideas so much that they lose the strength and discomfort he clearly intended to cause. There is a tendency, especially in popular discourse, to transform his provocations into something generic and harmless, as if he were only saying, "Be authentic, follow your heart." If that were the case, Nietzsche certainly wouldn't have become one of the most influential and controversial thinkers in history. In the end, this tension is what makes Nietzsche so challenging. He forces us to face uncomfortable ideas, to step out of our comfort zones, and perhaps that's exactly why so many struggle to deal with him. Nietzsche is the kind of philosopher who seems to divide people into two very distinct camps. There are those who completely reject his view that morality arises from resentment, and there are those who frown at the alternatives he proposes. But this time, I won't delve into morality. Instead, I want to focus on another controversial terrain that he loved to explore: religion. And look, Nietzsche didn't just provoke. He managed to irritate much of the world by directly challenging the idea of religious belief. Even if you've never picked up a book by Nietzsche and only clicked here because of the catchy thumbnail, I bet you've already heard one of his most famous phrases: "God is dead, and we have killed him." This statement has, over the years, become a battle cry for some atheists, especially in the 2000s, while others interpret it as a melancholic lament, full of pessimism about a world that has lost its moral and spiritual foundation. But Nietzsche's relationship with religion is far more complex than these simplistic interpretations make it seem. Essentially, he didn't see religious belief as something particularly brilliant, but also not as the worst nonsense humanity has ever invented. His critique goes beyond what we usually understand as religion. For Nietzsche, religion isn't just about believing in one god or several gods. It's, in fact, the act of blindly accepting a system of values that you inherited, without questioning it, without reflecting on it, without actively participating in the creation of those principles that guide your life. When Nietzsche writes, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him," he is talking about the decline of traditional religion in Europe and the potential consequences of this for society. This is where many people start distorting his ideas. Some see this phrase as a celebration, a toast to freedom, as if the end of religion were going to open the doors to a future guided by science, reason, or humanism. Others, on the other hand, interpret it with a tone of deep lament, almost like an apocalyptic warning that we are entering a point of no return toward chaos. And the curious thing is that both interpretations have some basis. Nietzsche, at times, speaks of religion as something intellectually suffocating that limits human thought. But at the same time, he acknowledges that the death of God is not exactly a glorious conquest. The phrase that comes right after "God is dead" is revealing. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Here, Nietzsche doesn't paint the picture as a liberating revolution, but as an act of deicide, a crime against something that, however flawed it was, offered humanity a sense of direction and purpose. This ambivalence is what makes Nietzsche's thinking so fascinating. He's not just pointing out problems, he's throwing us into the heart of a dilemma. Without God, without religion, without those inherited values, ... what comes next? Are we really prepared to take on the responsibility of creating something new in its place? There is a way of looking at Nietzsche's ideas that can unite opposing elements and bring a more balanced understanding. A central question in his work, from Thus Spoke Zarathustra to his posthumous writings, is the impact of the decline of religion. Nietzsche saw this change as a fork in the road. On one side, the risk of falling into nihilism, hedonism, or some form of new idolatry. On the other, the opportunity to become creators of our own values, which would determine the direction, the willpower of each individual. Nietzsche believed that some people cannot develop a strong will without a predefined belief system to guide their lives. These people end up crumbling. But he also saw another possibility. Individuals with robust willpower could embrace the void left by the death of God and from there rebuild something new. These would be the active nihilists, those who accept the chaos and, with courage, create meaning in that void, like children shaping castles in the sand of an existential desert. It is this creative spirit that Nietzsche associates with the concept of the Bermensch, Superman. Presented and thus spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche's criticisms of religion, especially Christianity, are known for their biting tone. He often portrayed the religious as weak, as if they were running away from the responsibility of creating their own values. Much of his animosity toward Christianity stemmed from its association with egalitarian morality, something Nietzsche saw as a limitation on human potential. However, not all religions received the same treatment. Some forms of Hinduism, for example, were viewed with more respect, as, according to him, they accepted natural hierarchies and promoted a kind of healthy elitism. Still, in the end, Nietzsche saw any religious belief as a form of intellectual cowardice, a refusal to face life without metaphysical crutches. It's easy to understand why this stance provoked so much outrage, especially among religious thinkers. After all, for those who believe in a personal, loving, and omnipotent God who defines objective values for human and universal well-being, the idea that this faith is a sign of weakness sounds absurd. Christians like St. Augustine or C.S. Lewis, for example, argued the opposite. Rejecting God would actually be an act of cowardice, an escape from what that belief would demand in terms of personal commitment and transformation. However, it may be unfair to characterize Nietzsche simply as someone who hated religion. He wasn't a provocative atheist who saw religion only as an obstacle to civilization. His critique went deeper. Nietzsche rejected any system that didn't allow for fundamental questioning or that encouraged people to place their devotion in something external, diverting them from the responsibility to develop their own willpower. Interestingly, this criticism is not limited solely to religion. In his unpublished writings, Nietzsche directed similar arguments toward those who see science as the ultimate answer to questions of values, showing that his distrust extended to any form of dogmatism, whether religious or secular. Nietzsche did not spare criticism of the so-called system builders. For him, this effort was as misguided as that of religion. Both, in his view, sought something external to dictate how we should live. This dependence on external factors, whether religious dogmas or philosophical structures, was, in Nietzsche's eyes, a way of escaping the most challenging and essential task of existence, creating our own values. For the same reason, he vehemently rejected the exaggerated valorization of racial or national identities. To Nietzsche, glorifying a race or nation was just another excuse to avoid the construction of personal values. He saw it as a reflection of a limited mindset, often fueled by resentment or internal weakness. When someone relies on immutable aspects of their identity, like ethnicity or origin, they are, according to Nietzsche, trying to find a shortcut, a way to derive meaning for free. And for him, this was contemptible. Nietzsche also linked attitudes like racism and particularly anti-Semitism to a type of resentful envy. In his interpretation, It was a petty reaction to the fact that other people seemed to possess something the envious person did not. These attitudes, he believed, were clear expressions of weakness, a way of escaping true responsibility, the responsibility of creating and affirming one's own values. His critique of religion was not exactly an isolated condemnation, but part of a broader view on the human tendency to accept belief systems for convenience or intellectual laziness. For him, this was a way to avoid the need to personally and genuinely address the issue of values. That said, Nietzsche recognized that, with all its limitations, religion was still preferable to absolute nihilism, the total void that consumes us when we fail to create our own values and hold some meaningful belief. However, there is an intriguing question in Nietzsche's ideas. What about those who are not capable of creating their own values? The values created by the strongest and most creative would inevitably be imposed on others, and in that case, wouldn't this create a new form of religion that he himself would condemn? This ambiguity sparks debates, and it is no coincidence that many religious thinkers still see Nietzsche as a direct opponent. Not only was he misunderstood due to ignorance, but there was also a genuine disagreement with his ideas. Although his position is more complex and nuanced than commonly admitted, it is fair to say that he was largely opposed to religion. This partly explains the criticism he receives from those who believe religion is fundamental to social cohesion and human well-being. Curiously, Nietzsche also did not spare modern systems of non-religious values. He condemned humanism with an intensity that, at times, seemed to surpass even his criticisms of religion. To him, humanism transformed egalitarianism, something Nietzsche deeply feared, into an absolute moral pillar, without any questioning. This, in his view, made humanism as problematic as the religious systems he rejected. Next, we can explore how Nietzsche takes this analysis into the psychological realm, delving into the role of power as the great driver of human motivation. When we think of Nietzsche, one of his most emblematic and controversial ideas that comes to mind is the will to power. This concept is as profound as it is polemical, perhaps because Nietzsche himself never defined it in a clear and unique way. At times, he describes it as a simple desire to feel powerful. At other times, he treats it as a form of self-mastery, and in his more mature writings, the idea transforms into a metaphysical principle that seems to encompass all of reality. But above all, the will to power was the lens through which Nietzsche analyzed human behavior. For him, understanding our actions, motivations, and even our failures was about understanding how we seek and exert power. However, like all provocative ideas, this one also sparked heated debates and, many times, misinterpretations. For that reason, I want to guide you through this concept in a simple and logical way, without losing depth. Don't worry, it will all make sense in the end. Essentially, Nietzsche believed that power is not just something we desire. It is what we desire above all else, more than pleasure, more than anything else. In his view, seeking pleasure is like chasing mirages, fleeting satisfaction that never truly fills us. In contrast, power, when achieved, offers something deeper, a fulfillment that transcends hedonism. He even suggests that happiness, at its core, is not an end in itself, but a byproduct of this quest for power. However, like all provocative ideas, this one also sparked heated debates and, many times, misinterpretations. For that reason, I want to guide you through this concept in a simple and logical way, without losing depth. Don't worry, it will all make sense in the end. Essentially, Nietzsche believed that power is not just something we desire. It is what we desire above all else, more than pleasure, more than anything else. In his view, seeking pleasure is like chasing mirages, a fleeting satisfaction that never truly fills us. In contrast, power, when achieved, offers something deeper, a fulfillment that transcends hedonism. He even suggests that happiness, at its core, is not an end in itself, but a byproduct of this quest for power. If we think about it, this logic is not so far from other systems of thought. Take, for example, the Christian view that true fulfillment comes from connecting with God. Just as Nietzsche sees pleasure as an illusion that distracts us from something greater, Christianity also considers worldly pleasure as a lesser temptation, in the face of divine purpose. In both cases, what at first seems satisfying ends up being only a shadow of something more authentic. Now, not everyone sees the will to power in this reflective light. Some interpret the idea as an endorsement of a world where everything is reduced to struggles for domination. According to this reading, existence would be a fierce competition, where human relationships are nothing more than veiled battles for control, friendship, altruism, sacrifice for the good of the other. These concepts would be fragile illusions that cover up the constant struggle for superiority. And to give weight to this criticism, it is true that Nietzsche often exalted historical figures like Napoleon, highlighting his ability to dominate others. He contrasted these great men with those who, incapable of wielding power, live in resentment and self-pity. In this contrast, it is clear that Nietzsche had little patience for those he considered incapable of shaping their own destiny. But does the will to power really reduce to this? Or does it offer a deeper view of who we are and what motivates us? Nietzsche doesn't give us easy answers, but that is precisely why his philosophy continues to intrigue and challenge us. Many times, the view we have of Nietzsche and his idea of power may be distorted or oversimplified, leaving aside essential nuances of what he really meant. It is easy to fall into the trap of interpreting the concept as something merely related to domination or brute force. However, by delving into his texts, especially Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals, we realize that Nietzsche presents a much more complex and fascinating understanding of what power means. An intriguing aspect is how he praises certain historical figures, the so-called great men. Sure, some examples may seem obvious, like Julius Caesar or Napoleon, leaders marked by their impact on the world and the strength of their actions. But Nietzsche also highlights figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Giotto, who were far from any direct association with violence or territorial conquest. These were masters of art, creativity, and thought. He even praises Plato, Heraclitus, and ascetics, celebrating in them an inner strength that transcends mere indulgence or worldly power. If power were only about external domination, this type of admiration would make no sense. So, what did Nietzsche really mean by power? After years of reading and reflecting on his work, I have come to an interpretation that I consider quite rich. Nietzsche seems to use the concept in two main dimensions. The first is external power, that which manifests in the world, shaping reality around us, building, conquering, or transforming. But it is the second dimension that fascinates me the most, the capacity for self-overcoming. Self-overcoming for Nietzsche is something greater and deeper than self-discipline. It is not just about controlling impulses or following rules imposed by others, but about directing one's life around values that one creates for oneself. This requires sublimation, a process in which our most basic impulses, like desire, anger, or even cruelty, are not suppressed, but transformed into fuel for something higher, such as creativity, thought, or love for life. This is where one of the central themes of Nietzsche's philosophy comes in: the creation of values. Nietzsche criticized systems like Christianity or Stoicism for trying to suppress our natural instincts, but he was not advocating that we should simply give in to them. On the contrary, he believed these instincts needed to be channeled, disciplined, and used as a source of energy for something greater. For him, life was not about avoiding pain or seeking pleasure at all costs, but about embracing everything it offers, the good and the bad, the light and the heavy. This idea culminates in a beautiful concept, amor fati, or love of fate. Loving fate, according to Nietzsche, means celebrating life as it is, with all its imperfections, contradictions, and challenges. It is not just about accepting the difficult moments, but learning to consider them as meaningful as the happy ones. It is an invitation to live fully, without denying any part of existence. For Nietzsche, achieving true personal power is the result of a long process of self-overcoming. It is like organizing all the conflicting parts of our will until they form a harmonious unity. When we achieve that strength of character, even the deepest sufferings can be transformed into something meaningful and valuable. That is why phrases like "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," and "he who has a why can endure" almost anyhow hold so much weight for him. This internal power was also the source of creativity that he deeply admired in figures like Goethe. Now, how does this relate to Nietzsche's admiration for Napoleon? According to Walter Kaufmann's interpretation, Nietzsche saw power on different levels. At the base of the pyramid are those without internal or external power, toward whom he felt a certain contempt. Then there are figures with great external power, like Napoleon, who earned his respect, albeit in a limited way. What Nietzsche valued most, above all else, was inner power and the ability to transcend oneself, characteristics that, for him, defined the true superior man. From this perspective, Nietzsche's idea of power is not about a constant struggle to dominate others, as seen in Jung's framework. Instead, the focus is on the internal battle we fight against ourselves. The goal is to overcome our own limitations and, ultimately, achieve a profound and unconditional love for life. That being said, it's important to recognize that Nietzsche did not dismiss external power, such as status or authority. He simply considered it secondary compared to self-overcoming. With that in mind, we need to avoid two extremes when interpreting Nietzsche. On one hand, there are those who view him as a megalomaniac obsessed with power and domination. On the other, there are those who attempt to portray him as an idealist philosopher solely concerned with the conquest of internal power. Both perspectives distort the essence of what he truly advocated. To understand Nietzsche, one must accept his nuances, the coexistence of his admiration for both external power and internal self-overcoming. Ultimately, we cannot ignore one of the most controversial associations in Nietzsche's history: the use of his ideas by fascism. Thankfully, this connection has been increasingly rejected. However, it still serves as a reminder of the importance of a careful and honest reading of his work, without oversimplifications that erase its complexity or controversies. Nietzsche was a thinker who challenged conventions, and understanding his philosophy requires confronting these very challenges directly. Nietzsche did not choose his family, and if he could have, he probably wouldn't have. His most complicated relationship was with his sister Elizabeth. She always seemed to find ways to irritate him, and her marriage to a fervent anti-Semite was the trigger that intensified their conflicts. Elizabeth's alliance with extremist ideas was intolerable to Nietzsche, who repudiated such stances. However, what occurred after his death was even more grave. Elizabeth became an enthusiast of the Third Reich, distorted Nietzsche's philosophy to serve fascist ideologies, and even gained Hitler's sympathy. Elizabeth not only adulterated her brother's image, but also directly intervened in his texts. As editor of Nietzsche's posthumous writings, she had extensive freedom to manipulate the content, and we will never know the full extent of how intentional her alterations were. One emblematic example was the deliberate delay in publishing Ecce Homo, a work in which Nietzsche openly criticized nationalism, particularly German nationalism. This interference seriously compromised the understanding of his philosophy, to the point that many came to believe he himself was a fascist. However, this mistaken association was not built solely on Elizabeth's actions. Some word choices made by Nietzsche within a very different context opened the door to misinterpretations. A notable example is the expression blonde beast he used to describe what he called the noble morality. Out of context, this term might seem like a racial exaltation, but the reality is very different. Nietzsche was actually making an analogy with lions in his work Genealogy of Morals. When he mentions the blonde beast, he refers to figures like Japanese and Arab warriors, which dismantles any simplistic racial reading. This idea is also connected with the symbol of the lion in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. For Nietzsche, the lion represented a phase of transformation on the path to the Übermensch, or Overman, symbolizing the break with old moral ties. Nietzsche's blonde beast was a symbol of strength and freedom, not a metaphor for racial hierarchies. Moreover, it's essential to understand that Nietzsche did not conceive of race as we understand it today. When he used the term, he generally referred to something closer to cultural heritage or lineage. Although he made comments about differences between peoples, such as Germans and French, those observations did not imply racial superiority or inferiority. He simply showed no interest in the prevailing racial theories of his time, much less in those that emerged later. In the end, Nietzsche's philosophy is much more complex and rich than the simplistic interpretations that attempt to fit it into fascist narratives. Unfortunately, the distortions made by his sister created a shadow that even today obscures his true message. Nietzsche held a profound respect for the traditions and cultures of India, something he inherited directly from Schopenhauer. This admiration shows that Nietzsche was far from being a racial elitist, as some might imagine. His elitism, it seems, was more individual than collective. He believed that some individuals stood out because of their personal achievements and development, not because of racial or ethnic characteristics. It's true that, at times, he suggested that biology could influence this superiority, but never in the sense of limiting it to a racial category. Nietzsche emphasized that exceptional individuals could arise from any human group. The problem is that, to modernize, the term elitism often carries a racial or biological weight that does not apply to Nietzsche's thinking. Moreover, some passages in his work clearly contradict any link between superiority and biology. For example, in one of his notes, Nietzsche refers to differences in class, race, education, and culture as absurd accidents, dismissing them as irrelevant, pointing out that true merit lies in what he called the ascending path, the ability to fully embrace life and transcend the slave morality marked by revenge against one's own existence. When he mentions concepts like lineage or blood, he may have referred symbolically to the legacy of ideas and behaviors that shape the individual, not to biological or racial inheritance. Nietzsche also used categories like barbarian to represent broader philosophical concepts, such as the strength of human passions and their impact on the spirit. This figurative language is often misinterpreted, especially when the reader tries to fit it into modern molds of thinking about race and biology. It is undeniable that his elitism may sound uncomfortable to contemporary sensibilities, even more so if we take his references to blood and lineage literally. In this case, one could argue that there are underlying eugenic elements in his thought. However, if we interpret these metaphors symbolically, his philosophy completely disconnects from any trace of racism or eugenics. In summary, Nietzsche was, above all, a complex thinker. He did not propose racial hierarchies, but he was not an egalitarian in the modern sense either. His focus was on the individual and his ability to transcend limitations, a concept that, though controversial, continues to provoke deep reflections on human potential and the traps of superficial judgments. Similar to what we discussed earlier, Nietzsche was fiercely critical of any form of idealization, whether it was of one's race, culture, or nation. For him, this kind of devotion was not much different from the herd mentality that he despised in organized religions. His stance was so firm that he cut ties with his sister and even with Richard Wagner due to the anti-Semitism they both expressed. Nietzsche was far from supporting the idea of a superior race or any form of national supremacy. In fact, in Ecce Homo, he spares no words in describing the utter uselessness of German culture. But, despite this strong criticism, it's undeniable that there are 2 points of contact between Nietzsche's ideas and the values later associated with 20th century fascism. The first is his rejection of egalitarianism, which he contrasted with an elitist vision of society. The second is his praise of power. However, it is crucial to highlight that, as we saw earlier, Nietzsche's vision of power is much deeper and more multifaceted than the simplistic approach adopted by fascists. This second point, therefore, is, at the very least, debatable. Here, it's important to be clear. Criticisms of Nietzsche do not arise out of nowhere. His work is complex, and like any great thinker, it left room for interpretations and even distortions. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, his sister, is a classic example of this, manipulating his ideas to fit ideologies he would never have supported. But we would make a similar mistake trying to pigeonhole him into humanistic, egalitarian, or any other modern label. Nietzsche was a thinker who escaped any mold, and perhaps the greatest injustice we could do to him is to try to reduce him to something he never was. If there is one point of consensus among scholars of his work, it is that Nietzsche was absolutely unique, and attempting to simplify that uniqueness inevitably leads to caricatures of his philosophy. To conclude, it's worth reflecting on how Nietzsche himself wished to be remembered. In Ecce Homo, speaking through the voice of Zarathustra, he says, "No fanatic speaks to you here. This is not a sermon. No faith is demanded. Now I follow only my way, and you also alone. That is what I want. The man who remains a disciple repays his teacher badly, and why not tear off my laurel crown? Now I command you to lose me and find yourselves, and only when all of you deny me will I return to you." If there is one thing Nietzsche teaches us, it's the freedom to think for ourselves, even if it means rejecting him to find ourselves. This passage has always seemed profoundly revealing to me. Nietzsche, at his core, had no interest in being elevated as an untouchable idol, nor in having his ideas accepted as absolute truths. On the contrary, he valued criticism, debate, disagreement. What he sought was something much greater and nobler: to inspire the creation of truly free thinkers. People who would not cling to the exact words he wrote, but who would absorb the spirit of his intellectual courage, his ability to question everything without fear. Nietzsche did not see himself as a teacher to be blindly followed, but as a spark, a starting point for the minds that would come after him, each one tracing their own path. It's fascinating to think that, perhaps, all his project, as suggested by the subtitle of Beyond Good and Evil, may have been nothing more than a prelude, a preparation for the emergence of a philosophy of the future, alive, bold, always under construction. If you've made it this far, I want you to know that this is not just about Nietzsche or philosophy on paper. It's about you, about the value of questioning, of looking inward and asking yourself, what is truly mine? What have I just inherited, and what do I want to build? That is something rare. Many people fall by the wayside, but you made it too. The end. That says a lot about you. Nietzsche believed in the strength of those who don't settle for easy answers, of those who face the uncomfortable void to create something unique. And you know what I see in you now, for being here until the end. An unsettled spirit, one that doesn't conform. And that, my friend, is what moves the world. So thank you for sharing this time with me. Every person who chooses to dive deeper, to debate and reflect, doesn't just keep philosophy alive, they renew and strengthen it. And if, in any way, this video touched you, share your perspective in the comments, because it's those dialogues, those exchanges, that transform ideas into something bigger now. Before we say goodbye, I invite you, don't let these reflections stay here. Take them with you into your life, your conversations, your dreams. And if you want to keep going on this journey with me, subscribe to the channel. There's much more road ahead, and I'd love to walk it alongside you. After all, as Nietzsche said, it is in the encounter that something new is born. Keep searching for what makes life worth living, not what's easy, but what's true. This video was just the beginning of a bigger dialogue. I want to invite you to continue this conversation with me in the videos right here on the screen. Each one complements what we discussed today and dives into topics that can transform the way you think. I'm already waiting for you there. Choose one and let's go together.